For those who I haven't met, my name is Aarti Khosla. I represent Climate Trends. Today's session needs less introduction, but we thought it comes at a very unique juncture. Yesterday, the 6 years of comprehensive body of work which establishes where we stand in terms of a changing climate was released. That needs little introduction. It has been 3 special reports as well as 3 working group reports, which have been put together into a synthesis report, which, apart from showing how far away we are from making progress on climate action, also shows the kind of integrated policies and redistributive policies which are needed so that any kind of development also brings climate gains. I represent Climate Trends, which, as you can imagine, is keen to look at any kind of development from a climate change lens. But even if it is not, this year is becoming more and more important from the point of view of climate geopolitics. India is also hosting the G20, and it's making sure that the gains that can be made on G20 can also be leveraged in the long term for India's climate leadership. But at the same time, this is also the year in which the world agreed to do some kind of a global stocktake, which is to measure progress on climate action since the time of the Paris Agreement. So really, the stars are converging in all directions to look at climate being one of the prime agendas through which geopolitics can now be measured. Amidst all of this, there are large questions to be discussed on what will enable climate action, and justice and finance really come up as very important in all of those discussions. We have our experts here, and I will spare you of the agony of trying to say anything on that. But that said, it does appear that over the last year or so, as India's own position on climate negotiations is evolving, it is becoming a very staunch advocate both of climate justice and the voice of the global South. And along with this, what is coming is an enhanced voice of India to increase capital flow to countries in the global South, to those which are most vulnerable, and essentially to raise a voice for bringing or addressing reforms in the banking system to bring more money basically to projects on climate. This is the kind of discussion that we wanted to focus on today, coming just on the heels of the release of the IPCC. The year is going to lead up, as I said, to the global stocktake. And every time the unanswered or empty question is that of finance, and which is why we have quite an esteemed panel here today who are going to talk to us and reflect on what's the situation and where are the opportunities and challenges, especially with respect to India's G20 leadership as well, but also what is it that can be leveraged. I do want to take the pleasure of introducing the panel once, and then I will hand it over to my colleague, who is also the editor of Carbon Copy, Srishan, who is on the call here today and will be moderating the panel and bringing out the best of the conversations. But first, please let me welcome Professor Avinash Persaud, who is the Special Envoy to the Prime Minister of Barbados on Investment and Financial Services. We all have heard of the Bridgetown Agenda, the meeting as well that will be hosted in France in June, and the high decibel on reforming on the banking system that is needed. And Professor Persaud is an expert in the negotiations as well as on financial services, and he's served on several committees. He also sits on the Transitional Committee, which has recently been set up on the negotiations on loss and damage. And we do hope to hear from you, sir, on what is the landscape looking like. Thanks very much for joining us on this call today. We have Dr. Rathin Roy, who is the Managing Director of Overseas Development Institute. His policy interests and research areas don't need much introduction, has focused a lot on macroeconomic issues in India, and used to be also the CEO of the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy in New Delhi, and has served in various positions, including in the United Nations Development Program. Thanks, Rathin, and welcome to this session. We have our friend and a very important climate scholar, Ulka, who's the director of the climate program of the World Resources Institute, an economist with over 2 decades of experience in climate change research, outreach, and capacity building. And she is leading now the WRI work on climate policy, doing a lot of work on low carbon development, energy modeling, national policies, subnational policies, and effective implementation across Indian states and cities. Thanks, Ulka, as well for joining us. And no panel, I think, on climate change in India will be complete till we
What an unfortunate place to stop.
She was referring to Mr. Rashmi. Shrisan, would you like to take over?
Associations in
Sure.
No, he's there. She's there.
I think she's back. We can let her finish in there.
Aarti, we lost you when you were introducing Rashmi sir.
Got it. That was the best thing. But let me just simply say that I really I welcome everybody here. Mr. Rashmi, we've all known, has been the chief negotiator from India's side, has held various positions in the run-up to and after the Paris Agreement, and as a special advisor to the Ministry of Environment and Forest and Climate Change, has been closely associated with the climate policy formulation in India, and especially as well related to various other issues like Montreal Protocol and so forth. We do have a wide and a great depth of experience and understanding on the panel today. I will only have to pause at this moment and hand it over to Srishan to carry forward the discussion.
Thank you so much for kicking us off, Aarti. Good evening to everyone who's joined us. As Aarti summarized so well, with the subject as intersectionless climate, coloring within the lines is nearly impossible. Junctures such as these offer us like rare opportunities to view the interconnections of climate change and climate action in high definition. And today we are examining the issue of international finance as a part of the agenda for India's G20 presidency. Just before we begin the panel discussion, I'll just lay a few ground rules. We'll include 1 round and hopefully 2 rounds of questions if time permits in the first hour of the session, following which the floor will be opened up to questions from the audience, and we'll hear closing remarks from the panelists to round off the session at the end of it. So without further ado, I'd like to call Professor Persaud to kind of begin the session. Post-COVID, we've heard the calls for climate responsive reforms at a lot of international financial institutions, particularly multilateral development banks, have been these calls have been renewed, and the subject has also become an area of focus when it comes to speaking about the tenure of incoming World Bank President, Mr. Ajay Banga. I wanted to know what, in your opinion, these changes or these reforms would have to contain. And also, do you see any kind of role for India as a G20 president to be pushing for such changes?
Well, India has a very important role. This chairmanship of G20 has occurred in the year in which we have a special moment, a moment that hasn't really happened before and probably will not come again, given that next year we have the US presidential election. So we have a moment this year. That's why we have the Paris Summit for a global financial pact this year in June. And throughout the year, India is G20 president. So I think it plays an important role. I think that, nobody on this call needs to lecture anybody about climate justice. We know the climate justice issues, that we are part of a very unjust system. But equally, we don't have a lot of time to sit in our armchairs and debate the justice of it, because the climate is warming up. And we've seen the tragedy of Pakistan last year. We see every year more people in India are perishing because of extreme weather and extreme temperature events, both hot and cold. So we need to act. So I think that, and the action on finance is something where India is well placed to address. I think we need to recognize that although there is a tremendous injustice of what has happened to the climate, nobody, no country is electing leaders on a mandate to send money to foreigners. They're getting elected to deport foreigners, not to fund them. So we've got to recognize that's the world we live in. So we begin by saying, look, we need to have much more investment in resilience. Countries like India and others around the world need to be resilient today, not in the future. But because resilience saves you money, you could borrow from it. You could borrow for resilience. So the multilateral development banks need to play a critical role in lending new money, expanding the amount they're lending, focus on the sustainable development goals, but in the additional money, focus on low cost, long-term resilience investing. Now, many of the G7 shareholders are moving in that direction. It needs India, I think, to play a championship role on that. Now, they can double their lending according to the G20 Working Party on Capital Adequacy Framework without anybody having to write more money. They can use their callable capital better. Callable capital could be reformed and become much more usable. They could use special drawing rights more. They could use other instruments. So in other words, they've got the capacity, if they had more risk appetite and a few more reforms, to double their lending. And so let's squeeze that lemon as much as we can, as quickly as we can. Now, the loss and damage is not something that countries can borrow for. If countries had to borrow every time there was some kind of climatic event, they would drown under oceans of debt long before the sea levels rise up. So we need to have additional revenue streams to fund loss and damage. And that requires a global pact. And I think India needs to be part of that global pact on how we get funding towards loss and damage. We think, we as in the Bridgetown Initiative, believe that we need new global taxes, 2% tax on fossil fuels, a new carbon adjustment tax, a tax on all insurance payments to help fund loss and damage. And to coordinate that and bring that together, India needs to play a critical role. So let me leave you there. There's a lot more we could talk about, but I'd love to hear more from your other panelists. But there's a lot that needs to be done. There's a lot that can be done without demanding that people write big checks, because they're not going to write big checks. It doesn't mean to say we should stop demanding it and stop demanding the moral imperative of it, but there's a tremendous amount we can do today without people writing big checks, and we need to make sure they do that. And India needs to play a championing and campaigning role on that.
There is a lot to unpack in what you said, from the political dividend or the how politically expedient climate policy can be, writing checks can be in domestic context, as well as the same level or the level of comfort in introducing new taxes that could be different as well. So we will come back to it, probably talk a little bit more of the Bridgetown Initiative, as well as the issue of funding loss and damage that you mentioned, particularly in light of last year's development of a new funding facility or agreement for a new funding facility. But sticking with financial institutions and the state of the global economy, Dr. Roy, I'd actually like to bring you in. We're currently, undergoing some sort of an economic unraveling around the world, which has exposed unsustainable debt levels in a number of countries, particularly low and middle income countries, which are also disproportionately affected by climate impacts and are often the least able to take up transition or climate action in terms of energy transitions because of the paucity of funds. Coincidentally, the year is also 2023 is also a year to complete reforms at the MDBs according to the Sustainable Finance Roadmap of the G20. How do you see such reforms affecting the debt burden of low and middle income countries that are vulnerable to impacts and require capital assistance for their transitions? And how do you see the role of the G20 and the Sustainable Finance Roadmap in this regard?
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. There are two questions here, which, have you heard of a chap called James Scott? He wrote a book once called Weapons of the Weak. So the question you ask about debt and the question of financing climate change more generally, there's an extremely unsalubrious outcome that is possible if the richer countries continue not to act or refuse to change the terms of the game. And that would be to just let climate change happen as a weapon of the weak. Because I don't really see why a country that is forced into indebtedness, and if you take the current round of indebtedness, except possibly Sri Lanka, most countries that are indebted today are indebted because of the consequential impact of a different kind of loss and damage, which was the impact of COVID on their economies and on their well-being. It's loss and damage. Now, if you're going to ask them to borrow for that, and I did warn about this 2 years ago when everyone was going on and on about SDRs. So that's not the point. You're still lending money. You're lending bananas or in dollars or in SDRs, and they're going to have to pay it back. You're also signaling then that countries' risk appetite for borrowing must be honored because there's a larger cause. You're not looking at grants. Now, what happens then? Something that I strongly think ought to happen, which is countries ought to default. There is really no alternative to defaulting if you're forced into taking debt that is not of your own making. So if we will need to have a new compact, I think, on what it means to be indebted such that levels of indebtedness cross a point where the conversation has to be how you pay it back versus early action not to make you indebted, because of loss and damage consequences, which is why I think what the Bridgetown Initiative said, this tax bit is due to be is quite sensible. When Avinash gave us a seminar here at ODI, the way I understood it, my very crude economist way was, no one's going to fund loss and damage. It's small enough for us to put all our grant money there. Okay. No one's really going to fund adaptation because rich people don't adapt. Rich people adapt privately. So it's a poor country problem, like India's problem, how you adapt to climate. And therefore, we need to find concessional finance for it. And lots of rich countries make money off mitigation. Everyone does, Elon Musk does. There's big money to be made in climate, huge money, trillions. So it's cool. Let mitigation, leave it to the market. They'll make their money. You'll get your electric cars. You'll get your air conditioners, which will run on solar. And, everyone will feel happy and righteous. So I thought that was the most practical deal that you could possibly give the OECD. I mean, what more can you say? Say, okay, as Avinash was saying, we know you're not going to give us more grants. Let's focus it where it ought to be. We know that you're not going to give us, the market's not going to come in and fund adaptation. Fine, let's get the concessional finance there. And let's get the market to fund mitigation. Good. There's a host of issues there which will require multilateral reform because multilaterals have an important role to play there. Firstly, as the preferred custodians of grant finance, I think. I can't imagine who else would do it except a multilateral. Need not be the World Bank, it could be UNDP or somebody else, but whoever. You need concessional finance to flow, and obviously moment you say concessional finance, multilaterals have a key role to play. So we have to have a sort of gathering of the multilaterals. And that is really where I think a lot of the stuff on callable capital and increasing sort of equity base. And basically also, I'll add one more thing there, which we could do. We have to do a deal, okay? I completely agree with Avinash. So here's a deal I give the multilateral banking system, which the northern countries will not like. And there's one more point I want to make. So all the things Avinash said will help us get concessional finance. And let us just stop pretending that some green climate fund or some blue initiative is going to provide money for climate change mitigation. Leave that to the capitalists, they'll do it. You won't like the result. The world will be a more unequal place, but that's how it's going to crumble. Because there's big money to be made there now, from Adani to Ambani to I'm not just rich countries, huh? Our Adanis, our Ambanis, our British Petroleums, our Elon Musks. They're going to make loads of money on climate change, and you guys they're going to benefit from the results on the mitigation side. All right, fine. But what I think, there are two dimensions in which I think fund bank reform, in addition to what Avinash said, has not been discussed. And is very important to discuss. And it's very interesting that US Treasury and India seem to think the same on this, which is not to ask the question I think Aarti posed at the beginning, which is how can climate foster development? How can or how can development foster climate? Essentially, there's a very positive link between the two, and that is productivity. So look at India, it's such a low productivity country. Okay, that's our basic problem. I mean, we suck because we're not productive. Our productivity levels are the lowest in the G20, sort of on par with Indonesia, which is no great shakes. And any respectable MIC, forget Vietnam and Bangladesh, have much higher productivity than us. So investments in more efficient systems that use less energy, that are more frugal, which is climate friendly, improve productivity. So what we need to come up with is a productivity compact that will demonstrably achieve progress to net zero, and will demonstrably improve the efficiency of large and middle-sized, lower middle income and low income countries. So that is a conversation I'm not seeing happening. I'm trying to foster it, but it is very difficult. But the key there is not to think about the climate as the end goal. The key there is to think about development transformation as the end goal and ask what elements of these can also make progress happen to the climate. I mean, look at energy, it's very clear there. Also look at agriculture. Look at the built environment, and that is the second transition we've got to make. And here multilaterals can help, which is stop thinking about energy as the only turnkey to climate change. We need to start thinking about bankable projects in agriculture, bankable projects in the built environment, and penultimately start taking a little more seriously. I know this government has a bad habit. There's still freedom of speech in India, so it's a bad habit of posturing and sloganeering and all that. It's very retro. But that being said, I think people are underestimating life. The point life is making is not, as I see it in London, people think it's about yoga or mystics or something and incense. It's not that. It's not the Prime Minister's furthest I can think from it being a hippie dippy. So it's a very pragmatic man who has taken pragmatic decisions in the past and no doubt in the future. Life is actually about challenging the notion that we can achieve our development and climate transformations without a change in production consumption patterns. And I think what he has done is tried to make it easy for someone to understand. So, and this goes back to an old development problem, which we're not dealing with since 1985. And oddly enough, this development problem came up in the environment space with the Brundtland report. Since about 1985, there's enough money, enough resources, enough food, enough textiles to feed, clothe, and educate and keep healthy every human in this world. It doesn't happen because the resources are imbalanced. That imbalance is reflected in imbalances in consumption, and those inter alia have caused climate change. So we need to start fixing that problem. And unfortunately, that strategic role that global thinking ought to do, whether it's the UN or the World Bank or other places, that strategic initiative has not been taken. I think India could do a lot to progress that in conjunction with the other two emerging economy presidencies, because all these three countries have been interested in this. Finally, I think there's one element missing here if we're going to get the multilaterals to work both for climate and for transformation, and that is the question of their governance. We cannot anymore be in a situation where, who is the executive director for Barbados in the IMF?
Canada.
Yeah, wow. So Canada is the executive director for Barbados in the IMF. Switzerland, I have no idea why, is the executive director for Uzbekistan in the IMF and World Bank. So you see, this sort of, and this is where the Europeans have a problem. This sort of post-colonial, balance of power legacy will need to change, because otherwise the mindset, and I'm not just talking about Washington, the mindset across the West will not change. And if that does not change, then there will be resistance. And this is a very important political line to navigate. I'll give you an example I was at a big meeting yesterday, big meeting, everybody was there, from Marina Mazzucato to, 100, we meet once a month. And someone said, oh, India has set up this committee for World Bank reform. Larry Summers is on it. And they didn't know and didn't care who the Indian was. And then somebody started talking about the France Finance Summit. And I said, no, it's not. India is the co-chair. It's a summit happening in the city of Paris. That doesn't make it the French summit. So these are not small things. These are very big things, because they reflect essentially Eurocentric mindset to climate change. And I think India is uniquely well positioned to challenge this. It could do it more politely, perhaps, and with less insecurity, palpable insecurity. But the fundamental case for doing so is clear. So I think, therefore, to conclude, a combination of things. One, to get the overall structural problem we are facing right, and to frame it in a way in which we can unlock finance for development and make climate, finance happen as a result. The second is to take the Bridgetown Initiative very seriously as a pragmatic acceptance of the balance of power and a deal offer to developing countries, to developed countries, to come up with a solution that is not too expensive for them and that accepts the rules of the game and doesn't ask for it to change. I think this realization the Indian presidency has got in my conversations last month in Delhi. And then finally, of course, we have to, unfortunately, you will not get away with 3 emerging economy presidencies without addressing the direct political economy and governance issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Roy. That was very interesting and very useful. Particularly, like we know that issues or financing adaptation or loss and damage has always been has never really attracted the capital that it requires, and it's always brushed under the carpet. There are no returns, so there's going to be no easy availability of money, and I don't see another way, a way other than large-scale reforms in many financial structures, particularly the ones that come from the MDBs, for us to be able to answer this or to be able to confront this challenge of financing adaptation and loss and damage. But shifting the focus a little bit towards mitigation as well. You did mention there's a lot of money to be made. I don't think there's any doubt in that. And yet we see that there are still gaps that exist in how much is required for emission cuts versus how much is available. And in India, we've seen the government issue green bonds to try and bring in more private capital towards low emission development projects. And yet there have also been these lamentations that foreign capital or overseas finance has not made its way into India's clean energy space. How do you see? Can India leverage its G20 presidency to lay the grounds for better flow of capital from abroad towards these green objectives? And how do you see this happening? Dr. Roy, this is to you, and maybe the same question we can take it forward with Ulka before I ask you a specific question to you.
Who did you want to respond to this? Ulka,
So,
right?
Dr. Roy, you can go ahead, and then Ulka can continue after that on the same question. I'd be interested in hearing from her as well.
But I didn't fully understand your question, I'm afraid.
Right.
Can I actually, because I think the question is, how do we galvanize international private savings into investments in India for green? And I think that one of the key issues is the cost of capital, and it's something that I know you and I've been doing a lot of work on that recently. The IEA publishes a report which shows that the cost of capital for a utility-sized solar farm in Germany is around 3%, and it's around 10% in India. That's your problem. So the same technology, it's a profitable business in Germany, and it's a barely profitable business in India. So one of the things that the Bridgetown Initiative is trying to do is lower this cost of capital. Now, when you say this to the multilateral development banks, they're the only banks in the world who blame their customers when they don't lend. So they basically say, well, your problem is you've got the wrong policies, you've got the wrong plans, basically pull your socks up, it's your problem. And actually, if you look at the cost of the government borrowing of India versus government borrowing in Germany in local currency, it makes up 75% of the spread. So it tells you the cost of capital is really currency risk. Yeah. And that's not something that will be solved by those things they're spending all their time on. So we need an agency that actually sells cheap currency hedges to investors. And that's one of the things we're proposing, and that will drive private sector savings into the industrializing emerging markets for their low carbon future, because we can't ban them because that will retard their development. We have to finance it, and finance it in a profitable way. Sorry to interrupt.
Not at all. In fact, if I may, that's very helpful, Avinash. If I may just elaborate on that quickly, if you can bring Alka in. I have been working on a proposal. I don't understand why the World Bank and the IMF certainly, but why we cannot include in the IMF's Article 1 responsibilities a commitment to lend in local currency. Now that will work obviously for larger middle-income countries, but you have a number of fairly reasonable currency unions which we can work on and develop institutionally. We already have it in West Africa. We have something similar in East Africa. We have a lead currency in Southern Africa. And we have sort of a quasi-arrangement, I think, Avinash, in the Caribbean. I'm sure Mercosur can explore it. There are lots of large economies there. And if we were able to then get these people to take on the currency risk by lending in foreign currency with a very simple formula, which we can elaborate later, but I'm proposing a formula, which is your current account deficit should translate automatically into an estimated depreciation in your foreign currency, reverse for your current account surplus. That estimated depreciation will be part of the deal of the cost of your capital. Any other random or volatile factor that happens other than your own governance should be insured and hedged. So you actually break down the hedge and make it cheaper by focusing it on unpredictable currency depreciation. I'm saying this to you not as the idea to be adopted, but to say that actually there have been ideas around for ages. And here Avinash is right. It is fundamentally the laziness of the international multilateral financial system that is comfortable. It's a bit like I remember stand chart bankers in Zambia when the bank came and did its horrible privatizations, would go out, make some money in the markets by selling yesterday's bonds. 11 o'clock in the morning, they were off for golf. They had no work, they made a lot of money. It's a nice life, you can get it. It's a nice life if you can work at that kind of World Bank. I don't think the globe can afford that anymore. With the IMF, again, the Article 1 money can be used, the IMF's Article 1 resources can be used preemptively to be able to back these volatile, sort of potential volatility in the expansion of funding. There is, however, one problem which we will have to confront, which is a simple macroeconomist problem. If I were to quadruple climate finance to India tomorrow morning, you wouldn't be able to absorb it. You really wouldn't. So we have to also recognize that we have an absorption problem. And just imagine the land acquisition you'd have to do. So what are the areas in which a climate finance expansion to scale can happen and can be absorbed within a short enough time frame is something I think countries need to work on. And it's, I think, something that India needs to both highlight and lead on going forward.
That's very interesting. Thank you. Ulka, do you have anything that you would like to add to this?
Sure. Maybe one thing I can add is that apart from the the point that Rathin made about countries should just default, I think it's also important to note that countries have had to cut back on their domestic spending on building resilience and adaptation. In Fiji, we know that during the pandemic and during various cyclones, domestic spending on adaptation fell by 40%. in Bangladesh by 7%, in Indonesia by 20%. So it's not just a matter of not returning loans, but also needing that funding for adaptation, because domestic funding has had to be cut. The second point that I might add on this issue is that, with banks like the World Bank, for example, it's not so much, what is being discussed is not really generating new additional finance for green transition in sectors like energy, but simply shifting finance from sectors like agriculture, health, water, towards low carbon energy infrastructure. So that is something we must watch out for and guard against. It is different for the World Bank, and it's different for regional development banks like the Asian Development Bank or the African Development Bank. But certainly for the World Bank, it comes down to a matter of political will at the level of the US Congress if more money needs to be infused, not just into low carbon energy transition, but also in the sectors that are relevant for adaptation. And perhaps the last point I'd like to mention on the cost of capital issue that has been referred to is that a lot of that is about risk perception and the right investment climate. And in India, a lot of that work will have to be done at the level of state governments, subnational governments, states and cities. So all of the issues that we are talking about and all the capacity gaps that we are discussing at the national level are even several-fold true for the state and city level, which is where that risk perception will actually be operationalized as a cost of capital. Let me leave it at that for the issue of finance. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So I'd stick with you. One of the avenues that had become very popular, that had gained a lot of attention in the media, was the Just Energy Transition Partnerships. The governments of South Africa, Indonesia, and Vietnam struck a deal with G7 countries to fund their transition from fossil fuels, primarily coal, to ideally renewables. And there was a lot of talk about such a deal may be on the table for India as well. It's gone quiet in the past several months. Could you give us what do you think? How do you see the prospects for such a deal? Is it anywhere on the horizon at all?
Srishant, I'm going to sort of fudge the answer to this a little bit. I may not answer it very directly. The reason is because I think when the JETP, the JETP, that specific type of deal first came on the picture, there was a lot of excitement about it because it was something tangible. It was something, more beyond the $100 billion climate finance goal that we've all been waiting for. However, why it went silent, one of the reasons is when the details were revealed, that 97% of the JETP going to South Africa would be in the form of loans rather than grants. And so everyone who was looking at the just part about the JETP was obviously sorely disappointed because those activities are not well suited to being funded by loans. However, let me just say that the issue that I am interested in is much broader. You could think of it almost like a continuum where the JETP deal is the narrowest way of thinking about it. Broader than that is the concept of a just transition, a just energy transition, where we are looking at, for example, that when new green energy infrastructure is created, it should not continue to perpetuate the same inequities that exist in the current fossil fuel dominant economy. And then even broader than that is the issue of a green transition, the way Rathin was speaking about it, not just in energy, but in industry, transport, buildings, and dare I say it, even agriculture. So, if we look at this continuum from the narrowest possible definition of a JETP to the broadest possible, I don't think anyone will disagree that that broadest ideal is something that we all need to aim for. And both in US and Europe, they have tried to look at it from a perspective of employment, trade, competitiveness, and all of that. Now, given that the IPCC report came out yesterday, there were two facts that I wanted to cite from it. One is the fact that first came out in the WG3 report last year and was repeated in the synthesis report, that the richest 10% of people in the world are responsible for nearly half, 45% of the greenhouse gas emissions. And the bottom half, 50% of the world's population are responsible only for 15%. So there is an inherent inequity, injustice in all of this that needs to be addressed. However, another fact, we also know that the current and planned fossil fuel infrastructure is going to lead to 850 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions. And the 1.5 degrees Celsius carbon budget only allows us to emit 510 billion tons of CO2. Now you can argue about the limit, but that's the mathematics of it. Another fact that is not there in the IPCC report, but which researchers from India like Tejal Kanitkar and T. Jayaraman have talked about, is that the modeled economic pathways, which form the basis of these mitigation opportunities, they assume that the per capita energy consumption in North America will increase much more than current levels. And I don't think all of it can be explained by the electrify everything hypothesis approach. And worse, that the per capita energy consumption in South Asia will decrease in 2050 compared to present levels. Now, I find this very hard to believe. We had a journal club within our team and tried to poke holes in this. I'm also afraid that when I mention this to IPCC authors in the UK and the US, they're not really aware of this critique and certainly don't have a ready rebuttal to offer. So this is some of the inequity that lies behind the just energy transition, or the just transition. But as far as JETP is concerned, I think between South Africa, Vietnam, Indonesia, and India, there are huge differences in context, not just in the capacity of that sector. I mean, Discom here, South Africa is having major load shedding, which we don't seem to be having. The number of people employed, again, in India, the model projection show 10 times as many people would be affected as South Africa. And also the lack of alternatives, the lack of diversification of fuels and diversification of livelihoods. So I think the reason why there is less excitement and hope about JETP right now is because it is too small a solution, however tangible it hoped to be. It is too small a solution to really address the entirety of the problem. But if you look at the problem in its entirety, when it comes to things like MSME resilience, when it comes to things like new skills for new jobs for women, and when it comes to things like safety nets and pensions for the older generation who are laid off from fossil fuel jobs, a lot of this is going to have to come from domestic budgetary resources and from multilateral development banks, bilateral and multilateral grant-based financing. I'll just end with one last point on the issue of domestic budgetary resources. Our modeling also shows that these are going to be hit when you have the transition from, say, internal combustion engine vehicles to electric vehicles, because what it will lead to is a reduction in the use of oil. And that's a good thing from a climate change perspective, but from a budgetary perspective, India's government currently gets a quarter of its tax revenue from liquid fuel taxes, petrol and diesel. This is going to have a hit, and people have been talking about an alternative tax, like a carbon tax, for example. And this could also have a regressive effect and require redistribution. For a country like India, redistribution is no easy task, but it can be done. We are putting money in the accounts of farmers through the PM Kisan Yojana. We are giving people a flat rate, a wage rate through the MNREGA, which can be increased. So there are ways of recycling money from a new carbon tax back to those who are the most affected. And there is a way of using new taxes, not just to generate finance, but also to stimulate the switch from fossil fuels to greener alternatives. Thanks.
Thank you, Ulka. Professor Persaud, would you also like to add something to that? You're on mute, sir.
I feel our fellow panelist has waited so patiently, Mr. Rashmi, that we ought to bring him in, and then I'm happy to chat a little bit later about the JETPs, which I've been involved in a little bit.
Very kind. We can move to Mr. Rashmi. I know that Mr. Rashmi has also worked a little bit on JETPs and suitability for India. Maybe he can share some of his reflections before I move on to a question that might be a little bit more to do with the realpolitik of climate change. In case you have anything to share on the JECPs, sir, Mr. Rashmi.
Thank you very much, Srishan. I wanted to come back to this question of JETP towards the end, but since you have asked me, I'll just briefly mention here that it's important that when we look at the energy transition as either a global problem or a domestic problem, these are two different dimensions altogether. So the issues in energy transition at the domestic level are very different from what is happening at the global level. And in the domestic context, the just energy transition, the way it has been proposed by the G7 countries, doesn't really suit the kind of narrative that we are building here. The reason is that, as all of you have been pointing out, I mean, the earlier panelists, Mr. Rathin and Professor Persaud, have pointed out that ultimately the question of international finance flowing into India, that has to be different if we have to support green growth process or a climate-friendly process. So the JETP is not looking at those terms at all. So the fundamental question which as far as my information goes, which the policymakers have been asking is, well, how is this energy transition finance, which is coming in the form of JETP, how is it different from what is available in the international capital markets or in the international financial system? The multilateral financial system is already lending money to India. So will this money be any different? Will the terms of the borrowings be any different? What would be the composition of the grant and the loan, as Ulka was pointing out in case of South Africa? And more importantly, will it be covering the just dimensions of the transition at all? Will it look at only coal, or will it support renewable energy transition? So these are different kinds of questions which I think need to be gone into a little greater detail before we really see the real nature of the international finance coming in form of JETP. Let me now go back to the question which you put as far as the climate realpolitik is concerned. We must remember that this current year is both an year of G20 presidency by India and also the year of global stocktake. And in the global stocktake, we have been talking enough about mitigation opportunities, mitigation targets, and we have missed these mitigation targets several times. Now, so we need to talk about what we can do, given the fact that we are going to miss the mitigation targets. We are going to hit the 1.5 degree target. We're going to actually overshoot it. So given this fact, which is an established scientific fact, and the IPCC, the summary of policymakers, which was released yesterday, it has gone into this aspect at length. It has established the fact that we are going to overshoot. So given this challenge, this climate threatened world, how are the countries going to handle the adaptation, the adverse impacts, the adaptation issues, the loss and damage issues? We have a global goal on adaptation, a work program going on. Are we going to be able to clinch it in the COP28 this year? That is a really fundamental question. And global goal on adaptation is not just about finance, the way it is being made out to be. It's also about the kind of goals that we set for ourselves. And the goals have to be met both in terms of global efforts as well as domestic efforts. If we don't have a framework, we certainly will not have enough finance. The finance will actually flow, can be facilitated only if we have a reasonable framework which we can implement at the domestic and global level. So we need to have a adaptation framework in terms of what kind of targets we can hope to establish and achieve in the next 10 years, in the next 5 years. And so that is the real question. And what does it transform in terms of domestic action? It actually boils down to building a climate resilient infrastructure. So just as in case of mitigation, it is actually about building an just energy transition. So both of them whether it is in the area of adaptation or in the area of mitigation. It is actually about building climate resilient infrastructure and climate resilient energy systems. Both of them obviously require finance. But while we are looking at the issues of finance and involving the private sector, mobilizing international capital in ways that we can afford, the other important question which we should not miss is that of technology. And that is fundamentally the question of developing alternative energy systems, alternative fuels, where G20 can play a very important role. G20 will certainly not talk about global goal on adaptation. It will not talk about loss and damage, because these are issues which are going to be handled at the COP28 level. But G20 can certainly talk about the kind of finance that is going to be made available and the kind of technological collaborations that can happen to promote alternative fuels like hydrogen, biofuels, methanol. I mean, these are kinds of fuels which have to be made available to developing economies and growing economies in the future. Do we have enough technological tools? Do we have enough policy tools? Do we have the required institutional infrastructure in the developing economies? Those are the issues, kind of issues, which the G20 needs to be dealing with.
Thank you so much for that.
And come back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. It's I'm so happy you understood exactly what I meant when I said realpolitik. I wanted to ask you about the GST and what would be imperative for developing countries to try and get out of the GST, and you've answered that very well. Just related to that, India is keen to, we've seen for a long time that India has been keen to position itself as a voice, as a credible, stable partner of the global South, or a stable voice of the global South. Now, particularly in context of the GST, given that India has the G20 presidency as well, how do you think this presidency can be used to cement this position, or to cement this leadership role within the global South community? Or is that something that India should be looking to do at all? And if so, how can they go about doing it?
No, certainly you can see the Indian leadership has been quite active as far as mobilizing the global South is concerned, and that is certainly an area where India and like-minded countries will hopefully remain active. Why it is important is not just because these countries are being adversely impacted by climate change. It's also because they are the largest consumers of energy and the energy consumption is growing in these countries. So they are both at the cutting edge of adaptation efforts, and also the future of the energy system in the world. And the world will not change unless these countries change. So it's quite critical that the global South gets mobilized and a common thinking develops. Unfortunately, that's not right there. As you can see, the G77 and China, which negotiates on behalf of the global South or the developing countries in UNFCCC, doesn't speak in single voice. It talks in fragmented terms. They all look at their own sectarian perspectives, and you can see this conversation, the way it is happening in the area of loss and damage. This is equally divisive. So we need to be focused on the key issues which confront the developing world, the global South, and the fundamental issue is that of finance there and technology. We need to, as far as adaptation and loss and damage is concerned, primarily it will need to be funded with domestic efforts. I'm sure the global finance is not going to help any of the developing countries as far as building climate resilient infrastructure is concerned. That finance will have to be mobilized domestically on terms, obviously, with support of the private sector that we can afford. But the fundamental question is that of making an energy transition at the global level, and that requires finance. So we need a globally collaborative system of international finance. And I think Professor Persaud and Rathin have very aptly summarized this the key question is that of lowering the cost of capital. And how do we reduce? And that can happen only if we reduce the risk of investments in developing countries. That we don't have any system at the moment. If we really want to address the key issues of international finance, we need to create global instruments of risk reduction. And one of the possible ways is, of course, creating a hedge fund for meeting the currency risks. But equally important is to create a global fund which can address part of the investment risks at the domestic level. And
If
that's
I
I'd
may-
like to,
Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to push back a little bit gently on some of that, partly because we agree a lot, but let's focus on the areas of slight difference. I think firstly, the reason why we got a loss and damage fund for the first time ever was because of the unity of G77 plus China, which was quite rare. And I have to say, as a proud Indian, a result of the expert diplomacy of Pakistan. Pakistan led and did expert diplomacy, and G77 plus China was completely united, despite fundamentally different positions on a loss and damage fund, isolating Europe and America. And Europe then joined in, seeing. I was at that ministerial, every single minister was saying, we support a loss and damage fund. We support a loss and damage fund. The Europeans get dragged into it, leaving America. America's entire strategy was to isolate China, and it found itself isolated. And so it gets dragged in. So I think that's the first thing, is to say it is rare. But when they are united, it does show a rather immense power. Now, here's another area of disagreement, and I say this as friends. I think India is got some work to do to be a champion of the global South. India has historically and traditionally been a champion ever since independence. It led the global independence movement and the decolonization movement and the anti-apartheid movement and all of those things. But today, I'm in Copenhagen at a ministerial meeting of loss and damage. And I would say India was a bit isolated, because India says that, no, we are not going to relook at we look at NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. We believe there's no need to do that, and we shan't be doing it. I'm not sure that's the right language, especially when 40% of the world, 3.3 billion people, are burning up and drowning, are the most climate vulnerable people. I think India needs a different language around that. And secondly, India says that we are not going to entertain any sort of global effort to raise money for loss and damage, because we must maintain the distinct and differential responsibilities and circumstances. Again, I think that we need a global financing that reflects the climate injustice, reflects the disproportionate situation in the world and injustice. But to say that we're only going to accept solutions in which a narrow set of countries make all the contributions, we're just going to get stuck. If we had a global tax on the consumption of fossil fuels, it will be highly progressive, because we know who consumes the most. If we had a global tax on a degree of shipping of goods, we know who's going to end up. Those taxes could be progressive. So we need to think of. I would say that India has potential of being a global champion and returning to its long-held position. But I think that actually today on climate, it is a little bit, there's a little bit of friction there. And let me make the final point. And I think that those are solvable things, but we need to think about our language. And I think the final point I'd say on resilience and adaptation, that cannot be funded domestically. If you if you try to fund adaptation, the amount of the adaptation needs you need today are far in excess of local balance sheets. India may be the only country in the world that could fund it itself, but they are very, I mean, other countries cannot do so. So I think that that's why we need to engage the multilateral development banks to expand their lending. That's the reforms we need, and to focus on resilience. India may not have to benefit from that, but the rest of the global south is desperate for that.
Can I,
points? Yes, Mr. Rashmi, I see your hand is up.
yeah, I
Please,
just
please.
wanted to complete my statement.
Sorry.
Thanks, Professor Persaud, for
Avinash, please.
adding those points. First I'll comment on what you have just said. I agree that it's important to look at the loss and damage issue, certainly. But then the key question there is not just of financing loss and damage, but it's also of building the climate resilient infrastructure. And I'm sure there is no special window of international finance going to appear which will finance climate resilient infrastructure as such, or loss and damage as such at the global level. You are a part of the transition committee. I have seen how the transition committee worked when the Green Climate Fund was being set up. We discussed the issue of the global, the Tobin tax was being discussed. The other global taxes were being discussed, but none of this actually finally saw the light of the day. So there is some kind of real politics involved here, which you will see at the end of the day. And I wish you all the best if the transition committee is able to move in that direction. But having said that, the fundamental issue, why I said was that we cannot finance infrastructure. We cannot have a special window for financing climate resilient infrastructure at the global level, is that the problems are similar, both for energy transition and for infrastructure. Ultimately, it's a question of how finance is going to be mobilized. So that's a bigger, larger, a broader question of how the international financial system is going to support the green growth process in developing countries. And I'm sure that's a question I don't think we have enough time today, but we can, and I can certainly say that that is the kind of issue which India as a country is looking at. How the international support for this kind of capital can appear, what kind of institutions and systems can be put in place. The last point which I wanted to make was is about the mitigation goals. There is a mitigation work program also underway, which will be not concluded at COP28, but possibly later. And that is extremely important in the light of the evidence that has appeared in form of IPCC report yesterday, that we need to revisit our climate mitigation goals. And unless that happens, all our conversation here will become meaningless. Thank you.
Okay, we have just a few minutes before we have to jump to the audience questions. Dr. Roy, please go ahead. I see your hand.
No, I just wanted to make a political point, which is was a very interesting discussion for me. It's rare that I actually see a negotiator from India address these questions. Look, the idea of a global tax on anything to finance a global public good was a good idea in 2000, was a good idea in 1980. Lowering the cost of capital was a good idea in 2000, was a good idea in 1980. So what's so special about it now? I'll tell you what it is. And this is, I think, where we need to meet minds. I look at climate as the first time that the rich countries are going to hurt really bad if we don't meet these goals. So, in the old days when people were telling me about coal, all these, when I worked in the UN, I'd say, look, my kids are dead anyway. They're taking coal out of their bare hands in Jharkhand. They're going to die of malnutrition, of coal dust. That's what's going to happen irrespective of climate change. Your nice Norwegian kids, you are going to suffer. So this is a weapon of the weak for me because I have nothing to lose. You have a lot to lose. And therefore, do a deal with me. So I think what is missing in this entire negotiation, and that is why we have to move from a moral position on common but differentiated responsibility to, if you like, a blackmailer's position, to be very honest with you, which is, okay, fine. So your kids are going to face climate change. London last year looked like some famine-stricken part of North Bihar. It was all brown and people were suffering at 38 degrees. So cool. I suffer every year, right? I have floods, I have monsoons, I have malaria, I have smallpox, I have tuberculosis. What's COVID? So So that sense of acuteness of potential loss to rich countries, which is the only way they're going to open their pockets a little bit to prevent that potential loss. I'm not seeing that happening from where I'm sitting. The arguments are still far too abstract, and the West doesn't seem to understand, although it mouths it, the immediacy and urgency of the climate change damage that is going to happen to them.
Well, there's change. There's change. And there is a moment here.
Good,
Things are
good.
moving. I mean, it's
So do you
moving
think
slowly.
they'll do a deal?
It's moving slowly, but
Yeah.
the door has opened an inch. And that's
Okay.
why we need India to play a role of pushing this door further and championing that. And it's because of what you just said. You know, I'm trying to get my Caribbean people to not think of themselves as SIDS, small island development states. We're trying to rebrand ourselves as climate vulnerable countries. And I try to explain to my Caribbean diplomats that if you're not a SID, you will not become a SID. But if you are not a climate vulnerable country, you may well become a climate vulnerable country. And that is why these developed country kids are gluing themselves to the road on climate change. They're not gluing themselves to the road on water scarcity, on development, or gender violence. They should be, but they're not. They're gluing themselves to the road on climate change. So let's ride that. And so I would say, today, every multilateral development bank is reinventing themselves and boasting that they are now the world's climate bank. They're all redefining their lending and saying, oh, this is actually climate adaptation. I didn't call it that last year, but that's what it is, or climate mitigation. And the windows are opening. Money is being offered on climate mitigation and adaptation. That's why we're having to say, hey, look, we don't think you should be doing climate mitigation. Let the private sector get involved in that. You need to help the private sector push them, but you need to be focused on adaptation. And so I think the door is opening, but this is the moment that's why we're meeting. That's why we're here talking to each other, because there's a moment there, and we need to make sure we have maximized what we can get from this moment, because it will leave. It will go at some point.
Thank you so much. That was a very apt point to kind of round off the panel session, and maybe open the floor up to some questions from the audience. There are 3 that are there in the question and answer box. I encourage anyone with a question to kind of put your hand up, and we'll see if we can provide you the mic rights so that you can speak up. Let me just go one by one as in the order that they came in. So the first one is from Manoranjan. If you could, it's not directed to anyone in particular, but I suppose he wants reflections on policies that can be seen as protectionist policies that have arisen in the US and in Europe, specifically the Inflation Reduction Act and the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, that have come up, and what the implications of these policies would be on countries like India and the global South at large.
Let me just, as I'm in the middle of these negotiations, as I'm sure others have been as well, let me just say that what we are seeing in the world today is a frightening thing. Internationalism is retreating. The multilateral trade system is broken and is being further shattered. This idea of friendshoring, of national industrial strategy around climate is making that worse. Now, we should be worried about that as developing countries, because whilst trade has brought much inequality, it has also brought a lot of growth. And so that is a negative thing. But I actually think the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, which Europe is imposing in a typically European unilateralist way, is in fact not a bad idea. India at the moment is steadfastly against it. Now, what is the alternative out there? The alternative out there is some notion of a global carbon tax. I think that's a bad idea, because what matters of prices, as we know, is relative prices. You have a single price for carbon. It's going to have a different impact in India than it will have in Germany, than it will have in Sri Lanka, than it will have in the Caribbean. So I'm nervous about this idea. carbon border adjustment tax. So what that does is it allows every country to decide what their levels of carbon taxes will be. It maintains their sovereignty. They can make a decision, but what they can't do is use a globally low carbon tax to be an export model. And I think that makes perfect sense. Let India decide what is the right level of carbon tax for the Indian economy. That should be their prerogative. Don't let anyone else impose that. But they can't use that. They can't use a deliberately low tax to be the base to export around the world, because then we'll do nothing for the climate. And in fact, when India sees that other countries are getting tax revenues from Indian products, it will incentivize them to actually raise their carbon taxes. So I think it actually leads to a leveling up of taxes rather than what normally happens, which is a leveling down of taxes. So I actually think we need to make the CBAM a much better system, internationalize it. It should be done at the WTO. There should be independent assessments of what taxes are and then apply it. Otherwise, we are breaking up the international system into these different blocks, and I don't think that's good for development.
Mr. Rashmi, I see your hand is up. Would you like to come in?
Yeah, thank you. Very briefly, Srishan. In my view, the border adjustment of carbon tax tries to confuse the instruments of trade with the instruments of climate mitigation. And this is a really undesirable kind of a mixture that we are trying to evolve here. I mean, in the area of climate change, we should talk about international collaboration, international cooperation, and not of competition. The border adjustment of carbon taxes actually is a competitive instrument. And so this will upset the entire delicate balance, which we are trying to evolve at the global level for addressing climate change. Climate change is essentially about promoting international cooperation. And this will take the conversation completely in the other direction. So we need to have these instruments, certainly at the domestic level, and Europe is welcome to have its own carbon taxes, its own emission trading system. But the kind of system that India should have, or any other country should have, is for the other countries to decide, as Professor Persaud is saying. But UNFCCC certainly cannot be the forum where this instrument, the desirability of this instrument, or the feasibility, or the level of intervention is going to be decided. It's essentially about financing energy transition. So what kind of system we can build at the global level to finance energy transition, that should be the discussion, not about border adjustment of carbon taxes. That's a fiscal instrument, that's a financial instrument, and that's best left to the sovereign decisions of the governments. And let's not mix trade and environment issues here. So that was the short point that I wanted to make here.
Thank you, Mr. Rashmi. Dr. Roy, would you like to come in?
So even if you wanted to mix, even if you wanted to mix the two, sorry, yeah, even if you wanted to mix the two, I have no particular problem with that, except there are two problems here. One is the entire conceptually, there's a problem with taxing carbon. I'm a public finance guy, yeah? You tax production, you tax consumption, you tax trade. What are you taxing when you're taxing carbon? I don't know. I'm not. So leave aside that theoretical frailty, which is going to cost you, because the history of taxation is littered with badly designed taxes that have no clue what their tax base is. So you have a carbon border adjustment tax. Now, I'm going to only speak from India's perspective. India's ability to export to Europe is not dependent on inframarginal changes in price. It is essentially dependent on our competitiveness vis-a-vis three other competitors, possibly Mexico, but leave them aside for a minute, China, Vietnam, and to some extent Bangladesh. So unless these countries can demonstrably sell to Europe at more favorable rates by being more environmentally compliant than we are, the tax is not going to help us much. I mean, it's not going to hurt us much. And in any case, the reason why they're able to sell to Europe more competitive than we are is our productivity is crap. So it's not going to make any difference to our trading patterns. So it's a good thing to oppose because it doesn't hurt. On the other hand, you might even support it. It doesn't harm you in the short run. This is not to contest, I think, quite correctly the point of principle that Mr. Rashmi was making. But I'm just saying in
But
pragmatic
here's
terms,
the
it
problem.
doesn't matter. Pardon?
Here's the problem. Here's the problem. Let us say one area, Europe, has high carbon taxes and the rest of us don't. Okay, what's going to happen? All production, high, because what it is a tax on emissions. High emission production processes will leave Europe and come to places like India, right? So we will get some jobs, we'll get some output, but the global climate has not done anything. Nothing has happened to the global climate. That carbon tax in Europe has been completely ineffective in actually changing the global climate. However, if Europe then has a carbon border adjustment tax, and I can't then use India's zero carbon tax as a base to export back into Europe. Now what I'm doing is actually making Europe's global carbon tax make a difference to the global climate. Except I don't think it should be done by Europe, it should be done internationally. It's not really about what's in the interests of India here, it's what's in the interest of the climate.
I can't think of a single country that imposes taxes on the basis of global interest. But anyway.
Yeah, in fact, there is an article in the UNFCCC, Article 4.15, which specifically prohibits unilateral imposition of carbon taxes or carbon instruments of this nature. It says it has to be an instrument of cooperation rather than that of unilateral imposition of one's ideas.
I wonder if there is a chance or there is a path to bring about some kind of interoperability, some kind of standardization, so that it becomes a collaborative tool, and rather than just something that is utilized in specific geographies, make it into or creating blocks, so to say, in the world. But moving forward, the next two questions were questions that were already to a certain extent were addressed during the session itself. One of them on the JETP. Any reflections on whether JETP deals that have happened so far are too narrow, and what the government of India would consider as conditions for which with which it would be ready to kind of consider a JETP deal. And I think the question is one of bringing
I don't
justice.
think the issue is narrowness on JETP. I was originally anti the JETPs because it was based around the conceit that the problem with you developing countries is that you need to get your act together. You don't have a plan. We will put together a plan. We will develop a plan, and we'll put in a little bit of money. And once you've got a plan, a little bit of money, the private sector will flock to you. That was the conceit of the JETP. It was based around a developed country view about what is the problem of development. It was only about us not having a plan. It's kind of, you incompetent people don't have a plan. We give you a plan and the private sector will come. Well, that conceit turned out to be a conceit. They are plans, but the high cost of capital means the private sector is not coming. There's JETPs. But what's interesting, the JETPs did do good work on developing what a plan would look like. And what they found is that the plans cost even more money than people thought there was. So the South African JETP has got bigger and bigger and bigger now. But it actually did some proper work on the fact that, okay, if you close down the coal mines, there's a town next door, and all the people are employed in that town are in the coal mine. And so you need to change the development of that town as well as changing the coal mine. So the JETP did a lot of interesting work in that regard, and they found that the number for transition is even bigger. So I wouldn't say the problem is narrow. The JETP actually discovered there was some big investment, and we couldn't afford the investment. It would blow up our balance sheets, and the private sector is not coming because the cost of capital is too high. So what we need is that mechanism we talked about earlier, which is you attach it to the JETP, and it actually lowers the cost of capital for international money in climate mitigation down to levels of a developed country. Now, there may be other reasons why they don't invest in that project. Let that cost still be there, but let currency risk not be the problem.
Got it. I think that kind of answers the next question from Priyam as well. I see that your hand is up. Ulka, since the question had mentioned you specifically, I'd like to check whether you have anything to add to the JETP question.
No, thank you.
Okay. Moving on. So basically, Priyam, in answer to your question, the cost of capital in developing countries, including India, will have to be reduced, and there have to be some mechanisms for currency hedging, which will make investments in these geographies more attractive and feasible compared to investments in developed economies. There is a final question in the question and answer box, and I see one hand up, so we can take those both together and move towards ending the session. So the first one is from Sanjay Kumar, and are there any views among the panel on the possibility of setting up an international climate court or some kind of judiciary redressal mechanism?
I am all for it as long as there is no statute of limitations.
Sorry, as long as?
I'm all for it as long as there's no statute of limitations. And then we can start in 1890.
Right.
That would in fact solve your climate financing problem entirely.
Well,
There you go.
my view is that is correct, but that's not going to happen. So what do we want to do? Do we want to sit here and debate it? We know that the rich countries are rich. They are rich because they have put the stock of greenhouse gases up in the atmosphere. That in fact we can define their richness by only looking at how much greenhouse gases they've got up in the atmosphere. They like to tell the story that they are ingenious, they're technological, they're brilliant, they've got great universities. It's all the greenhouse gases up in the air is the reason why they're rich, and that's caused us a problem. So should they pay? Yes. Will they pay? No. So what do we do? I like the idea. Rathin is one of these is a wonderfully radical. I like the weapons of the poor and the weak, because we don't have very many, right? So let's use the ones we've got. But I think that I mean, it's like reparations and slavery. I mean, these are big issues. They're just issues, and people need to pursue them. But should we run our affairs as if we expect it to happen? No. So we need to have people out there doing it, arguing for it, pushing for it. But I think we need to have alternative ways in which we manage to transition our economy, make our countries more resilient, and get some external funding for loss and damage.
Can I just come in here?
Yes, please do.
Thank
Briefly,
you. This is certainly a radical idea, but slightly difficult to implement. UNFCCC is certainly not the forum where we can think of bodies like this. And I'll give a historical perspective here. The Kyoto Protocol, in fact, did have a compliance mechanism, which could never be actually put into practice, and no country was punished for not meeting its mitigation goals. And even in the Paris Agreement, we have a compliance provision. It's not that the idea of compliance doesn't exist. There is a compliance panel, but the panel is expected to look at the degree of effort, the kind of the actions that have been taken, and to the extent to which the countries have faltered in meeting their commitments. And then ultimately the idea is about promoting cooperation, promoting understanding of the constraints which hinder a country from meeting its NDCs. So it's not about punishing a country, it's not about punitive actions, but for promoting collaboration and cooperation.
Thank you so much, sir. Manoranjan, I see you have your hand up. If you can just state your question and also mention who you would like to ask it to, very, very quickly in just a few seconds. Manoranjan, can you hear me? Okay, I think we've lost him. So that brings us to the end of the questions that are here, and it also leaves us with just a few minutes, about 4 minutes of time before we are scheduled to end the session. So I'd like to invite each of you to just give maybe 30 seconds worth of closing remarks so that we can, round up the day end and go on our evenings. Maybe Professor Persaud, you can start, and then Dr. Roy, Ulka, and Mr. Rashmi.
Well, this is a critical year, and it's great and gives me some pride that India is at the top and the front of this year as chair of the G20. We're going to have a global stock take. We already know what's in it. What we need to do is connect the global stock take with a roadmap of what needs to be done. What needs to be done can be quite practical. We need to double the amount of lending by the multilateral development banks using the existing callable capital. We need to focus that new lending on making the world a more resilient place. We need to come up with new taxes for loss and damage. Just focus on loss and damage, not focus on all the other things. And so it's a small new tax. And we also need to galvanize the private sector to be investing in developing countries for mitigation. These are three things that I think are achievable over the next 18 months, and that should be a key focus of the Indian G20 presidency.
Yeah, I would agree with everything Avinash said. I'd just add three other things to what he said. Number one, we have to be conscious that in the area of finance, that every single solution we are proposing to unlock incremental finance for climate change would have worked as well to unlock incremental finance for development. So we have to ask, and therefore the question of whether you spend that money on climate change or development remains pertinent. And there is no automatic priority that climate change is going to get when finance is unlocked, unless that becomes a conditionality which costs the rich countries something, either in terms of supernormal profits or in terms of greater grants. There has to be some give there. I think India is well positioned to do this. India is at the moment not in a very good place in terms of our own fractious politics, but there are two areas where we have remarkably bipartisan thinking. One is on climate, and the other is on fund bank reform. So it's good these two are coming together. And the third, I think you will see, and I know this from my own engagement with the G20 process last March, the finance track, I don't know much about the other tracks, is that one, there is a meeting of minds between the US Treasury and Government of India on climate finance and how to proceed with it. And that goes more to what I was saying, which is you need to shape these questions in terms of broader questions. There could be environmental questions, there could be questions about agriculture, but public finance, but I think there's a joint interest that the rhetoric and the transmittal of these messages changes to talking, if you like, about sectors where development transformation ought to happen in matters. The third is, I'm afraid the politics is not going to go away. You'll have to wait for the end of South Africa, or you'll have to completely defenestrate South Africa with its power cuts and your jet peas before, unless you do that, it is very clear that these three emerging economy initiatives are not going to stop shy of discussing governance and political issues. Let me give you one practical example. I already gave you one about executive directors and voting reform. That's very important. It'll have to be on the agenda. You can't siloize it. The other is the whole question of the AAA rating. I think it's a very good idea for climate to be given greater weight, climate action to be given greater weight in a country's sovereign rating. The question is what will give. You may not know, but 40% of a country's sovereign rating comes from its per capita income level. So that I can do nothing about in the short term. So if you want to give me 5 basis points for climate, take it away from per capita income. That will make capital more affordable. That will make developing countries better business cases for investment, and that will go to lowering the cost of finance. So I think we're going to see a number of very productive conversations happening in the Indian presidency. Next year, as Avinash rather perspicaciously pointed out, we have the US election. If those don't cause trauma, then you can expect the Brazilians to take this forward. And the South Africans get their act together in 2 years' time, which I sincerely hope they would. Then you will see 3 years of emerging economy leadership. And that, in the current juncture, can only be a good thing.
Thank you. Ulka.
Sure. I read an article recently in The Guardian, which was about whales, WHALES. And when young white kids were protesting, not blowing themselves, but climbing onto boats about the killing of the whales, what didn't work were bans, preserves, rules, the private sector found a way to bypass all of these. What finally worked was apparently that the world got to understand a little better the complexity of whale song, and also that the world practically ran out of whales. There just weren't any more to kill. So I think what probably will apply to the climate change context as well is one of these. If we do have to recognize the importance of civil society pressure that's coming from the younger generation. There's a reason for that. But perhaps all of these instruments, these policy instruments that we're talking about, are really part of an entire arsenal of weapons in the fight against climate change. No one will be perfect. No one will be a silver bullet. We'll need all of these. But finally, what we need a little more is perhaps, as Avinash said, a change in language, even the language that we use with each other, little more empathy, and perhaps just an understanding that that all of this is finite. Even our lives are finite. There's this, since people are talking about books, there's a book called 4,000 Weeks, which says that's the measure of a human life. We often act as if we will live forever. So I think perhaps a little bit of that understanding will have to come as well in tempering the tone of some of our own discussions. Let me just leave it on that philosophical note. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Ulka. And finally, you have the last word, Mr. Rashmi. Please take it away.
Thank you very much. Well, the agenda of G20 is really very wide. It deals with a number of issues. But if we are going to focus on the climate change issue, so in the context of climate change, I think there are three practical things that can be attempted. One is obviously trying to find enough finance for supporting the energy transition process in the G20 countries. And this is really the key challenge before us. And energy transition, why? Actually, we should be looking at the entire gamut of transition across all economic sectors. So that's why we have low emission development strategies that are now being talked about, which is not just about energy transition, but transition across all sectors. But this entire transition process, this can be supported by G20 if we are able to modify the way the international capital flows take place currently. And many of the panelists have referred to those issues. So I think G20 needs to look at how the international financial system can be reformed, and the capital flows can be facilitated at lower cost. And here I will just add one word, is that there is enough debt capital available. But the challenge is to mobilize equity capital. And that is why we need some kind of an international instrument for reducing the risks at the global level. And G20 countries can certainly, they are very well placed to create a fund of this nature. Second was in terms of international collaboration for technologies like green hydrogen, biofuels, and of course, the methanol, which can finance long distance transportation, green aviation, green shipping, and things like that. So G20 is again very well placed to take lead in these matters. And lastly, where G20 certainly cannot take a lead, but can act as the major platform where this issue can be flagged, the issue of adaptation. We have a global goal on adaptation, which is going to be decided at this end of this year. I think it's time that the issues of technology and finance are balanced with the adaptation issues, and G20 really takes it up in light of the issues of life, which India's Prime Minister has been pointing out.
Thank you so much. And with that, I think we'll call it a close for the session today. Thank you everyone for joining us. Special thanks to our panelists. Anyone with a question that we were not able to get to, please do reach out to us, and we'll connect you with anyone from the panel that you would like to connect with. Thank you, and have a good evening, everyone. Bye-bye.